Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is almost our last session of international crisis management for Ukrainians and Kenyans and Kazakhs and a Romanian and a Croatian and a Iraqi and an Indian. It is December 8th, 2025. What a privilege to have Professor Angela Stent with us. I know that I've sent you her bio, but I have to highlight a few of these. It's incredible. Uh, when we talk about the IC, we call it the IC, the intelligence community. What are there, 16 entities, something like that?
Yep.
At the very top is this thing we call the NIC, the National Intelligence Council. Very few people are selected to be part of the NIC. You have been part of the National Intelligence Council. And just for orientation, what the NIC does, among other things, it ventures to predict the future. And maybe Professor Stent can tell us how do we figure out what the future is going to be? Let me just point out, and you've seen the bio, I think, everybody, but the American Academy of Diplomacy, this is the very, very top of the diplomatic world in Washington. To be a member of the AAD, you must be a former ambassador. It's the most elite, and it gave Professor Stent the what was the name? The Douglas Dillon Prize for the best book on the practice of American diplomacy in 2014 for Putin's world, and it certainly is. And let's see if I can say this.
It was
She
actually for another book, The Limits of Partnership, US-Russian Relations in the 21st Century.
Thank you, and I will ask you to give a précis. I know that's an unfair question. She's on the board. Let's see if I can pronounce this. Of Mirovaya Ekonomika и Международные отношения.
No, no more, no more.
No more. Oh well.
That's an
Anyway,
old bio, okay?
yeah. Oh well. Update us. Let's just set the scene here. Today's news: an attempted coup in Benin. We do have uh, Benin present on this call, Professor, and it's always upsetting when there's a coup, whether it succeeds or fails. This is very upsetting. We've seen a very tough week again in Ukraine. We've seen talks going nowhere, and I hope you'll have some reflections on that. And then this interesting story, I'm sure you've seen it today. President Steinmeier of Germany is saying perhaps the Alternative for Deutschland should be illegal. Should a political party ever be illegal? Um, I don't, but please, would you would you start at any point that you wish to and tell us your knowledge is so broad and your experience. I don't know where to start, but you do. So,
Okay, well,
uh,
thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people on the call, depending on where you were. So I thought I would actually cover three issues fairly briefly, and then I'm happy to answer your questions. I do
Perfect.
want to say a few words about what Vladimir Putin's worldview is, because at the end we're going to come back to the new US national security strategy. And
Oh
just
my,
today, the Russians said that they think this is actually a very good strategy
I know.
and it really aligns with their own views. Then I did want to say something about the CRINC, Russia's new allies in the war in Ukraine, China, North Korea, and Iran. And then I will come back to the current state of the war and of negotiations. And then I'm
Great,
happy,
great.
if that's all right with you, then I'm
Absolutely.
happy to take your questions. So let me just start with the Russian worldview. In 2008, I taught a class at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO, where many of the future diplomats, businessmen, people who are going to work intelligence agencies are trained. So it's an elite institution in Moscow. And none of the students, and this was a class on US-Russian relations, all of my students were well read. They came from, affluent families. The course was in English. They were well traveled. Anyway, none of these students believed that the Soviet Union had collapsed because of its own internal fundamental weaknesses. They all believe that the Soviet Union collapsed because of the nefarious actions of the United States, the CIA, the Germans. And this, is a fundamental problem because we have generations now of Russians since 1991 who really don't accept the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Vladimir Putin, I would say, is our number one candidate for that. And they don't accept the fact that Russia, it's still, of course, a major power. It's still the largest country in the world, but that its great power status that it had as the Soviet Union is somehow diminished. And I think this is, one of the fundamental problems we face. And I think it's something that Western and other officials, I think, didn't recognize enough. In the 1990s, the deputy consul general in St. Petersburg, the American deputy consul general, had a conversation with Vladimir Putin, who was then the assistant to the mayor. He was a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, responsible actually for foreign economic contents. And Putin, even at that early stage, said to him, we don't accept the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was illegal, and we're going to reverse it. So anyone who thinks that the current war in Ukraine is because of NATO expansion, fundamentally, I think, doesn't understand the views not only of Putin, but of many of the people around him, that Russia must be a great power, that it has a right to dominate its neighborhood, and that it has a right to be treated, as the Soviet Union was, a great power, to be respected, to be feared, and that its interests, and Putin talks a lot about legitimate interests, are as legitimate as those of the West, of other parts of the world too, and that the West should accept that. But the West is particularly important here because obviously the war that's going on now in Ukraine is also a result of the fact, from Putin's point of view, that the West has never accepted that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence in the former Soviet countries, particularly those to its west, and that it should respect that, and that what it's been trying to do, which is encourage Ukraine and other countries that were former Soviet states in their independence, and to have the right to choose what alliance systems they can belong to, what their orientation should be. This is, of course, the fundamental clash of interests that we see now going on in Ukraine. And this view goes back hundreds of years. In my book, In Putin's World, I quote Catherine the Great, the German princess who became Empress of Russia in the 18th century. And she said, that which stops growing begins to rot. And she said, I have to expand my borders in order to keep my country safe. So this is a country, again, the largest country in the world now, which doesn't have natural borders except in the north. And this concept of defensive expansionism is deeply rooted in the way that Russian leaders and many of the Russian people, by the way, see the world. And if you look at public opinion data now from the Levada Institute, which is still, I think, a very respected institute in Russia, a majority of Russians now say, yes, we would like negotiations to end this war, but we are not going to accept that we have given up territory and we have to have, the Donbas. And I would remind you that Russia has been trying to conquer the Donbas, the eastern region of Ukraine, since 2014, and it has not succeeded. It has taken more territory, of course, since the full-scale invasion in 2022, but this is something it's been trying to do for 11 years. And of course, it's now asking Ukraine to give up territory that it doesn't control. So this is, if you like, a proximate problem here. Let me now say something about Russia's new allies in this war against Ukraine, the CRINC, and what that represents. If you remember, or if you've studied this, in September, there was a big celebration in Beijing to celebrate the end of World War II in Asia. The narrative there is a little different from the narrative of other countries that were allies in the war. But anyway, there was a celebration there, and you had Vladimir Putin, you had Xi Jinping as the host, you had Kim Jong-un from North Korea, all on the dais there, when they had a military parade inspecting all of the sophisticated military technology that China has. The Iranians were also there. They weren't featured as prominently as the others. So these now are four countries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, that have one thing in common. They share common grievances against the US, against what they see as the US trying to dominate the global order. They're all committed to a post-West multipolar order. And it's not that they share values, but they certainly share grievances. And they do represent, I think, a threat to the United States, to its allies in Asia, to its allies in Europe, because they have a fundamentally different attitude towards what they think that the world should look like. Now, if we talk for a few minutes about China, China is the most important ally that Russia has now. They're not formal allies, but they have a enhanced strategic partnership. China and Russia have never been natural allies. If any of you have read Russian literature, you know anything about Russian history, the majority of Russians, particularly those in the political sphere, the intelligentsia, they regard themselves as Europeans. Even though Russia is a Eurasian country, culturally, they have never felt that they're part of Asia. But despite the fact that they're not natural allies, they again have very pragmatic reasons now for cooperating. And if it were not for China, I think Putin wouldn't have launched the full-scale invasion and wouldn't be doing as well as he is. The Chinese are instrumental. Putin, of course, was in Beijing before the full-scale invasion began, even if maybe the Chinese leadership didn't realize exactly how expansive Putin's goals were in Ukraine, they still obviously backed him. China has repeated the Russian narrative about the causes of the war. They blame NATO, they blame the West for the war, and China has given Russia substantial economic, military, and technological assistance for the war. It's a top purchaser of Russian hydrocarbons, of course, along with India, and we've just had Vladimir Putin in India too, which we can talk about. And the Chinese have been providing the financial wherewithal for the war to continue. We have Chinese contract soldiers fighting with the Russians in Ukraine, and the military cooperation has increased substantially over the past few years. Now, we had President Macron very recently in Beijing. I think in the beginning, the US, its allies, hoped, in Asia as well, hoped that China would be a mediator in this war. But it's clear that China is not interested in being a mediator. Xi Jinping told Macron that again. And it's not neutral in the war, even though it claims it is, because it clearly supports Russia. And a few months ago, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told the Kaja Kallas, who is the European Union's foreign policy chief, that Beijing could not accept a Russian defeat and doesn't want the war to end anytime soon because it doesn't want the US to focus solely on China and on the US disputes with China, as long as it's distracted in looking at Ukraine. And of course, China and Russia both seek this post-West global order, and they have created these alternative multilateral organizations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, where, of course, the West does not have a seat. But there is still Sino-Russian rivalry in Africa, in parts of Latin America. The Chinese are not thrilled about the North Korean-Russian rapprochement because they're concerned about how this might embolden North Korea. And we still have unresolved territorial disputes. What is now the Russian Far East belonged to China until the mid-19th century. And apparently, I don't speak Chinese, but if you go on the Chinese social media, people are still talking about eventually they're going to take that territory back because it really belongs to China. Let me say a couple of words about Iran. Iran has also been very helpful for Russia in this war. against Ukraine in the beginning when the Russians failed to take Kiev in 3 days. The Iranians provided Russia with the Shahed drones that the Russians are using. Now they're manufacturing them themselves. Last year, there was a strategic partnership arrangement signed between Iran and Russia. It's not a mutual defense cooperation as Russia now has with North Korea, but still, it sort of codified a partnership that's been there for decades. Russia and Iran were allies in Syria, of course, before the defeat of the Assad regime. Now that cooperation has ended, and of course, Russia has already been negotiating with the new Syrian leadership, whose forces, of course, it was attacking while Assad was in power. But I think the Russians are going to keep both the naval base and the air base that they have in Syria, maybe at a reduced rate. But of course, the new Syrian leader was also recently in Washington, so the Syrians are obviously looking to diversify their contacts and their support. Let me say a couple of words about North Korea. I would say it's the second most important partner in the CRINC for Russia. The Russian relationship with North Korea has been transformed since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. North Korea has backed Russia on every vote in the Security Council, the UN Security Council, and it's recognized Russia's incorporation of the 4 territories that Russia claims to have now annexed since the war. North Korea has been instrumental in supplying Russia with ammunition, with other weaponry that it needs for the war, and of course, it sent soldiers to fight there. About 10,000 of them, with rather high casualty rates, were sent to fight there. And now there are North Koreans there helping to monitor drone operations and apparently also on other industrial construction sites. And so, as I mentioned, Russia and North Korea now have a strategic partnership that involves this mutual defense clause that means that if North Korea were attacked by another country, Russia is now obligated to come to its defense, just as North Korea is now helping Russia. Now, a lot of people talk about this, the CRINC as a new axis. I don't think it's an axis. What it is a series of bilateral relations between Russia and these 3 other countries, all of whom are supporting Putin in the war. Putin, as you know, regards this war as existential, both for regime survival and for his own personal survival. And therefore, these partnerships are very important. And I do think that they represent a major challenge to the rest of the world. But I would say one thing we know from history is that autocracies are interested in their own survival. They don't have any kind of like the Axis powers in World War II. They don't have any treaties between all 4 of them. And in the end, they're going to be focused on their own regime survival, and if that contradicts what they're doing in terms of their support of Russia, that would take precedence over it. All right, let me now, of course, turn to the Russia-Ukraine war. It's a war of attrition, of course, now. Russia has made incremental gains in the last few months. But as I said in the beginning, of course, it hasn't taken the whole of the Donbas region. It is nightly, of course, bombarding Kiev. It bombards civilian targets. It bombards the energy infrastructure. It's trying to make sure that the Ukrainians don't have heat and light over the winter. And in places even like Kiev, sometimes for 14 hours a day, people do not have electricity. The Russians there's a humanitarian, really very difficult situation. The Russians have abducted at least 20,000 Ukrainian children, and they've forcibly put them with Russian families. They're trying to Russify them, or they're in sort of children's homes and orphanages. The way that the Russians treat people in the occupied territories, is cause for great concern. If you read any of the accounts, if you see any of the videos about this, and we know that the Russians are murdering prisoners of war, which of course is against the Geneva Convention. So you have the impression when you listen now to American officials that Russia is making all these major gains, that war is lost for Ukraine. That's actually not true. I mean, the Ukrainians are still pushing back. They have a manpower problem. The Russians have a manpower problem too, but they have soldiers from Cuba, from North Korea, as we said, from other countries fighting there. It's more severe for the Ukrainians because, of course, they have fewer people and they do have a lot of draft evasion. So they're not winning, but then neither are the Russians winning. This is still a war of attrition, but it's becoming increasingly brutal. And of course, the Ukrainians are now coping with a domestic corruption scandal, which of course has reached into the president's office with the resignation, or actually firing, of the head of the presidential administration, Andriy Yermak, who was a very powerful individual. Donald Trump's view of all of this, and I think we have to come to that now, is that Trump came into office wanting to reset relations with Russia. Trump admires Putin. He dislikes Zelensky. We know that. That goes back to his impeachment, Trump's impeachment in his first term, and he has always wanted to. He's had these dreams of great business deals in Russia, starting when he went to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1987. He's been wanting to build a Trump Tower there. And we know now from Wall Street Journal reporting that right at the beginning of the second term, Steve Witkoff, his main negotiator here, a real estate magnate with absolutely no diplomatic experience, and I guess now Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, also a real estate person, they have been in contact with Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who studied in the United States, speaks good English, and knows how to talk to Americans. They've been in contact since the beginning, envisaging all of these big business deals, much of which I think is illusory, because the business opportunities in Russia really aren't that great, particularly with Russia nationalizing more and more businesses. But we'll put that aside for now. So President Trump he wants to reset relations with Russia, to have this magnificent economic relationship, and to maybe come to some new arms control agreement with Russia, because the New START treaty, which deals with strategic nuclear weapons, is expiring in February of next year, of 2026. So I think he has that kind of he envisages that too. He does want the war to end. I think that's genuine. But even just today again, he portrays the Ukrainians as the ones who are the obstacles to peace, even though President Zelensky has accepted a ceasefire, but along the present line of contact. So what happened here? It's a complicated story. So a couple of weeks ago, I think, a 28-point peace plan was leaked. We can speculate by whom, to the US and Western media, other media, a plan that appears to have been largely written in Moscow. Even the phrasing of the words sounds as if it's translated from Russian. And of course, that represented all of the maximalist Russian demands. Ukraine has to give up the rest of the Donbass, even though Russia doesn't control all of that territory. It has to say it will never join NATO. It has to reduce its armed forces to 600,000. They're about 900,000 now. And it's not allowed to have any foreign troops on its territory. So you might ask, what is in it? What's in this agreement for Ukraine? And the only thing that's really in the original 28 point peace plan is that $100 billion of the 300 billion, euros, of Russian frozen assets that are largely held in Belgium, that 100 billion of those would be used for a joint US-Ukrainian reconstruction facility, and the US would get 50% of the profits from it. Otherwise, there's really absolutely nothing for Ukraine in this agreement. We have to remember that the war has already incurred up to 1 million Russian casualties, either killed or severely wounded. We don't know the number for Ukraine, but it's also significant. So after this was leaked, we also got 2 leaked phone calls. Again, one can ask how and why that was done. One of them was between Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Dmitriev, where he was, excuse me, Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy, chief foreign policy advisor, where Mr. Witkoff was coaching Mr. Ushakov on how they could appeal to President Trump and flatter him so that he would accede to Russian demands. And the second one was a leaked call between Mr. Dmitriev and Mr. Ushakov, where they were saying, well, we have this plan worked out, but we have to get American buy-in here, but we probably will. In other words, they were discussing how to get the US to agree to their peace plan. So since all of this happened, we've had a whirlwind of diplomacy. You've had a new US-Ukrainian peace plan endorsed by the Europeans as well, which I think has 19 points, maybe 22. We haven't seen this. But the Russians are insisting now on talking about the 28-point peace plan. You had Witkoff and Kushner going to Moscow, meeting with Putin, having a very long meeting with him, 5 hours, after which they returned saying, nothing had changed because Putin is not willing to compromise on his maximalist demands. And after that, Putin was even stronger when he was in India saying, this was too long a phone call. And, essentially I got bored. And the Russian media mocking the American, negotiators who went there. So nothing's happening on that side. But then you've had Ukrainian negotiators spending 3 days in Miami with Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner. Then you have, and coming back and saying, well, we're still working on this. And today, President Zelensky is in London with Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, Emmanuel Macron, and of course, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister. And I just, before I came on here, just watched the public part of the interview, the beginning of their session. And Friedrich Merz was very tough, saying that the plan that the US has, really, they cannot accept. So there's an impasse here. It's quite possible that President Trump will continue to blame Ukraine for the lack of a solution here, and they'll continue to pressure the Ukrainians to accept these maximalist Russian demands. And the only way, if one wants to have a peace deal that's more equitable, would really be to put pressure on Russia. Because Putin has no intention of ending the war at the moment because he thinks Russia is winning. And if he looks again at this US national security strategy, and he looks at the fact that Trump is much more interested in dealing with Russia than he is with Ukraine, presumably Putin thinks that in the end, the Ukrainians will be forced into surrendering this territory. And, I would remind you that this war is really not about territory. Yes, Russia would like to say that it controls the whole of the Donbass, but of course, Putin wants to dominate all of Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine doesn't look west again, and doesn't have any ambitions to join NATO. And even with the European Union, that's kind of ambiguous. And this would be the beginning of Russia, recreating a sphere of influence, at least in the countries to the west of Russia. And if you look at the US national security strategy, the main enemy there seems to be Europe, which is blamed for the lack of freedom of expression and for not carrying its weight internationally. This is just what the Russians say. And there's not one word of criticism of Russia in this national security strategy, but rather that, there has to be a much better relationship between Russia and Europe and the US and Russia. So I guess I'll stop there, and I will look forward to questions and comments and disagreements if there are.
Yeah, no. How could one disagree? This is an amazing. My hand has been. I'm worn out taking note. This is an enormously helpful tour d'horizon You're seeing the emojis on the screen, Professor. Um, and the group tends to come in with chats, and I encourage everybody to do that. If you're able to unmute, I encourage anybody to come in directly. Um, you began this talk, Professor, with a talk of this breathtaking news that this national security strategy was approved and Putin was happy with it. This is really shocking.
Mhm.
Heather Cox Richardson, the historian, um, in her posting a couple of days ago, said, "Why bother having an NSS? You could say it in 18 words." That's a quote from Heather Cox Richardson. Uh,
What are
I
the 18 words?
well, I forget. She apparently she had picked out 18 words that were used by Adolf Hitler to explain his national security strategy. Let me just say to everybody, if you want a good laugh, it's perfectly open and online. The Russian Federation National Security Strategy. It's hilarious. It tells it delineates everything that Russia is not doing, and it too is quite breathtaking. Um, is this not a deep embarrassment that Putin would find the what many Americans consider a betrayal of American values, this national security threat? The group has it. I've sent it around.
Okay.
It's shocking. Is this not an embarrassment to the United States or to you personally? Uh,
Well, in my view, of course, it's a huge
yeah,
embarrassment,
yeah,
but it's also very worrying because you essentially now have the US endorsing what's Putin's view in a way that, there are three great powers, right? The United States, China, and Russia. India maybe coming up there, and that, they can divide the world up, that smaller countries have to listen to what the larger ones say. We're back to Yalta in 1945. The only thing is it's not just the US and the Soviet Union, it's now obviously the People's Republic of China. You can go back to Hitler as well. I won't touch that at the moment.
yeah,
It is embarrassing and it breaks with all US tradition. And it's essentially also saying, values are irrelevant. We have to be pragmatic. And particularly the criticism of Europe, it just echoes what the Vice President J.D. Vance said at the Munich Security Conference, where they are, blaming Europeans for suppressing freedom of speech. And you alluded to Germany or the German president talking about banning the AfD. I mean, given Germany's history, they have a special, view of neo-Nazi parties and anti-immigrant parties, which is maybe different from other countries. And one can argue whether one should ban political parties or not. But that this is the view. And we know that J.D. Vance and Elon Musk, even though it doesn't have an official role anymore, they like the AfD. That's their partner of choice. The neo-Nazi extreme right-wing AfD. So I think it is bad. Now, you can also say, well, how important is something like a national security strategy? It doesn't have a legal standing, but it just shows you what the ideas are, what the values are that are guiding this administration, and therefore it has to be taken seriously.
yeah. And this word multipolar, it is used repeatedly in the Russian national security strategy, and it's a code word clearly for a new world order that lessens the influence of the United States. It's quite clear
Yeah.
that that's happening. I would add to that in the global South, and Tim Moriti is a professor at the University of Cape Town who's
Mhm.
published in Foreign Affairs and who says this thing called the rules-based international order, it never really had the global South in mind. Let's turn to something else. I find this very challenging. The fact that the global South, very legitimately, is now turning away from what we used to think of as the inevitable perfect way of thinking of the world, which was order and global cooperation. It sounds good, but the fact that the global South doesn't really like this concept works to Russia's benefit, I think. I would just say Where's Marco Rubio? Why is he never even part of the picture? What's going on here?
Well, th this administration has disdain for traditional American diplomacy. They think the State Department is quote unquote too woke.
Yeah,
That it concentrated too much on what they disparaged DEI, diversity, and bringing in both into the State Department a more diverse group of people who became diplomats who were, if you like, before um, unable to join the State Department, and that even globally, it supports democracy promotion and things like that. So they have disdain, and the joke now is that there are all these diplomats, State Department people sitting around in the cafeteria because there's nothing for them to do, and instead, Trump is sending businessmen to negotiate with a country like Russia over a major national security threat, and a major Russia has started the largest war since the end of World War II. Um, and so they have disdain for all of these traditional groups. In the first Trump administration, it wasn't. They may have had that disdain there, but they did have people who were very respectable and very qualified in the State Department, and also in the Defense Department, and so that's why you don't have Marco Rubio. Yes, he's the Secretary of State,
yeah.
but he has been an afterthought in these current negotiations with Ukraine. Apparently, he didn't know much about the 28-point document, and we know that because I think it was leaked on a Friday, and on a Sunday there was a national security conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia,
Right.
the Halifax Forum, and Secretary Rubio called in. There was a bipartisan group of Congress people there, Republicans, Democrats, and Senator Angus King, who is an independent. And Senator Rubio said, this is, the first time I've seen this document, and, don't worry, it's not going to go anywhere. And then literally 2 or 3 hours, and then the Congress people said, "Can we talk about this openly at this meeting? It's a public meeting." And Secretary Rubio said yes. And then a few hours later, he reversed himself. And he said, "No, no, no, this is our strategy." So you just have the sidelining of professional
Yeah.
diplomats. And you have President Trump claiming that he's ended all of these wars. I mean, we just had Rwanda and the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, in the White House signing some agreements. If you look at the actual track record, though, it's much more complicated. But yeah, and let me just say, on the Global South, I did a study a couple of years ago with a colleague on the way that the Global South viewed Russia's war in Ukraine. And it's quite clear, and it's quite understandable that many countries in the Global South you know, thought that the U.S. and the Western kind of focus on the war in Ukraine. This is a European problem. It's
Mhm.
not their problem. And then, of course, they talked about U.S. hypocrisy. Um, that the U.S. was criticizing Russia for what it was doing in Ukraine, but what about? And you can name whichever war you want. Vietnam, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and those things. And then I think the other thing you talked about South Africa. One of the dialogues we had dialogues with the democratic BRICS, so Brazil, India, and South Africa. And one of the interesting things about the dialogue with South Africa is that obviously there, many people, and particularly the older generation, still view President Putin and Russia as the heirs to the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union supported the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, whereas United States governments didn't support it like that, and so they feel that they owe this particular debt to Russia, and they view Russia and President Putin much more favorably. And the last thing I'll say on this, the fact that the Trump administration now says that the Afrikaners in South Africa are a persecuted minority and they get special treatment with visas, it just shows you that this is kind of a topsy-turvy world.
It does. I will add to what you've said. I was in the State Department building last week, and I can tell you there's nobody in the cafeteria.
Oh,
They're
really?
gone. They're gone. They're gone. I would
Good.
also add, if they don't want us to be woke, do they want us to be asleep? What's the opposite of woke? It would be asleep, right? Tatjana has a marvelous, very rigorous chat here, but in order of first a priority,
You do have a
Boniface.
hand up. Can you
Okay,
see
yeah,
that?
that's right.
Yeah,
Boniface gets the first
right.
comment.
Mhm.
Boniface, can you unmute? Boniface calls us from Kenya.
Yeah,
Ah, good.
yeah. Thank you, Dr. Whitman and Professor Stent, for the enlightening presentation once again. And I'm joining from Kenya, where our president was actually at the White House for the signing of the DRC agreement. But my question to you, Professor Stent, is on your reflections on the role that non-state actors and especially the oligarchs in Russia have played in the trajectory of this conflict. We saw at the outset there were sanctions on people like Roman Abramovich,
Mhm.
which he has now lost in the European Union, and those were meant to curb the sort of influence that Russia would have in the conflict. How has this played out in your view?
So the problem with the sanctions on some of these oligarchs is that it has made them, more dependent really on Russia and has drawn them closer to Russia. Now, Abramovich is an interesting case because he was also a mediator just after the full-scale invasion in March of 2022. There were talks brokered by President Erdogan in Turkey between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and Abramovich was a go-between between them. And he has been, I mean, it's unclear what his role is now, but he's definitely been playing a role. And sanctioning him, made it more complicated. And then if I think of another oligarch, Mikhail Friedman, who largely lived in London, and was sanctioned by the West. He has now gone back living in Russia, and it's made him, if you like, more dependent on Putin. Now, at the beginning, a number of these oligarchs, before they were sanctioned by the US, came and they said, think twice about what you're doing, because this isn't going to help resolve the war. So what you've really had since the war began, the full-scale invasion began, is most of the oligarchs have had no choice but to support the war, even if we know that some of them don't support the war and think it was a bad idea. They're not going to say it out loud, and they've supported Putin. And so Anatoly Chubais, who of course is a Yeltsin era oligarch, he's one of the few who left Russia and is not living in Russia anymore. But even he has been cautious about what he said publicly because he still has people whom he used to employ in Russia. So I don't think that the sanctions against individuals have worked that well. There is a very good book called Punishing Putin by the Bloomberg correspondent. She lives, I think, in London. And she goes into details about this. I mean, they've lost their yachts, but the yachts kind of are in these various harbors, and it costs money just to maintain them. And then there's a lot that happens through Dubai, where a lot of Russians have moved,
Mhm.
where you can kind of evade some of these sanctions. So I don't think that sanctioning the oligarchs had really any influence on Putin's decision making. And I think some of the ideas about sanctions that people in the West had, I think, misunderstood the role of these oligarchs that are allegedly close to Putin. Putin has a very small inner circle. So you have a couple of people who are very rich, whom he's known really since childhood. They don't have official positions. And then, of course, there are a few other people in the inner circle who do have official positions. But that's it. I mean, they're not going to consult any oligarch on what they should be doing. And any oligarch that would criticize them would have problems. And there are a couple of oligarchs who've had unfortunate accidents or fallen out of windows since the war began. So I think there's also a lesson there.
Now, those are targeted sanctions. What about removing Russia from the SWIFT system? And what about the more severe sanctions that some people have said should be multiplied fourfold in order to really pressure Putin? Is that fanciful thinking?
So I do agree. I mean, I do think that one way to pressure Putin to come to some a real negotiating agreement with Ukraine instead of this kind of performative stuff that we're seeing, which isn't real. Yes, I mean the sanctions have had some impact. And the Russian economy they're facing inflation, they're facing a recession. They themselves have said that, but they do have a wartime economy. And so far their growth rates have been okay, but it's going to get much worse. Those are the IMF forecasts for Russia. So the most important thing would be sanctioning the oil and gas exports. And the Europeans have more or less weaned themselves off Russian gas. I think they will have fully done that. That's just their goal by 2027. But of course, China and India have been the two largest purchasers of Russian oil, Turkey after that. So the US imposed sanctions a few weeks ago on Rosneft and Lukoil, and that was intended to put some pressure on Putin. This was one of the weeks where President Trump was trying to put pressure on Putin. And so both China and India have then said, well, we're going to import less Russian oil. But there are ways of evading this. And the other thing is the shadow fleet that carries Russian oil, let's say to Africa or somewhere else, and then it goes back it goes back to China or it goes back to India. And just this week, President Trump now announced, well, we sanctioned Lukoil, but we're not sanctioning their gas stations in other countries. So you see, and then Hungary was given an exception for this. So if they really imposed these sanctions and followed through with them, and Russia was really deprived of significant hydrocarbon earnings, that would put much pressure on Russia, more pressure on Russia. And the other thing, of course, would be releasing 140 billion euros of the 300 billion euros that Russia has, the frozen assets, and giving them as a loan to Ukraine. But the European Union has been unable to reach agreement on this. And we now understand that the Trump administration has put pressure on the European Union not to do that because they want these reserves to be used, either in Ukraine or in US-Russian deals once the war is over.
Yeah, just a footnote. The foreign minister from Moldova was here last week, and he said Moldova, a short time ago, 100% of their gas and oil was from Russia. Now it's zero. Now that's quite an achievement. We have, in order of appearance, Tetiana Mikolajczyk, who has a tripartite comment. The first is basically, thank you very much. You've really clarified a lot in your talk. Then she turns to a question: what sort of format or peace agreement could lead to a truly lasting peace? If there was a 28-point plan and maybe an 18-point plan, if it were the Angela Stent plan, what would be in it?
Okay, so do you want me to shut? Yeah. So, my ideal would be a peace deal where, Ukraine sooner rather than later joins NATO so that it'll be much more difficult for Russia to invade. But that's not happening now. Ukraine, of course, cannot push Russia back from where it is now. So the most, realistically, beneficial peace deal would be one where you have a ceasefire along the current line of contact. And what that would mean is the Ukraine would have to, for now, de facto recognize that Russia, does control a large amount of the Donbass, but Ukraine would still control those parts of the Donbass that Russia doesn't. It would involve, I don't think it's terrible if Ukraine does cut back on the size of its military. My military analyst friends say 600,000 men in peacetime in the military is still quite expensive for Ukraine. And therefore that wouldn't be the worst thing. Ukraine will still have a very large and very competent army, but it's not, it wouldn't be greatly disadvantaged. And then you have to have security guarantees. I mean, again, watching President Zelensky briefly today in London, that's what Ukraine needs. If it's going to have a ceasefire along the current line of contact, there's no guarantee that Russia won't then reinvade, when it feels that it's recouped a bit. So you have to have security guarantees that not only from the Europeans, but that involve the United States as well. And that's what's so worrying, because it looks as if that's not happening at the moment. And that would mean not US troops, but continued US intelligence support for Ukraine and for the Europeans who were involved there. And the US is a backstop. And then I think the idea that you would have some European troops maybe deployed in the western part of Ukraine would be beneficial. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, because you have to persuade the publics in Germany, well, not so much Germany, let's say, but certainly Britain and France and some of the other countries, the coalition of the willing, Poland maybe, that they wouldn't mind being deployed in Ukraine. But you have to have security guarantees. Now, at one point, there was a rumor that the US was willing to give Ukraine, quote unquote, Article 5 type guarantees if it signed a peace agreement. And that begs the question, well, if the US is willing to give Ukraine Article 5 type guarantees, then why not admit it to NATO? Because that's what it is, collective defense. So I'm very skeptical about that. But I think what you could achieve, the best you could achieve, would be the ceasefire along the current line of contact. And the question of the occupation of the Donbass and the future of Crimea, that has to be left for the future. But the main thing, would be to stop the fighting and to have enough security guarantees and, of course, investment in Ukraine and reconstruction help, so that Ukraine could be fairly certain that it's not going to be reinvaded. And the other thing would be an accelerated path to join the European Union. I'm also a little bit skeptical about that, because it's easy for the US to say, oh, European Union, take Ukraine in soon. But if you go to Brussels and you talk to people there, the EU would have to reform itself before it would really admit a country like Ukraine, because of course Ukraine is a major agricultural producer, and you have the other current members of the European Union, including Poland, by the way, who are worried that they would be overtaken or swamped by Ukrainian agricultural exports. So hopefully that'll be worked out, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. And I guess Poland is already upset. There have been incidents at the border of Polish farmers blocking the incoming goods from Ukraine. When you say current line of contact, I'm not questioning what you're saying, but it makes me think of North and South Korea. Can we accept the idea of a frozen conflict?
I think we may have to. Yeah. So that is, the various models, the porcupine model, right? Which is the analogy with Israel, where you arm Ukraine to the teeth and you hope that that will deter Russia. But I do think that, we might have to accept a frozen conflict. And of course, this has been going on in Korea for decades. But if it holds, if there isn't another Russian invasion, then at least it enables Ukraine to recover and strengthen its own statehood.
The good not being the enemy of the perfect, or however that goes. Tatiana, I will get to your question about elections in a moment, but let's turn to Victoria Kravitz. Can you unmute? Would you be willing to, Victoria?
Hello, dear Professor Stent. Thank you for your input and your amazing lecture. Thanks to our Professor Dan Whitman. He always engages so many interesting speakers. It can be brought us a great perspective on different things. So I want to ask also the question. So the Ukraine have defined a Euro-Atlantic course, and we see the steps toward the EU accession, and the experts say that we will be in the European Union up to 2030, but what about the NATO? What do you think? What is the prospects of Ukraine joining NATO, and what steps needs to be taken? I know that this topic is always discussed, but maybe you have some thoughts and can share it with us.
We've heard some. Now let's hear some more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, oh, so as long as Donald Trump is president of the U.S., there's no NATO,
Mhm.
joining for Ukraine. Um, Hungary is also a country. Let's see what happens in the Hungarian elections next year, right? So it looks as if the challenger to Orban should win. On the other hand, authoritarian leaders can also do things with electoral results. So let's see. But you would have to have also a government in Hungary that couldn't veto this, or you have to change the way NATO organizes itself. I do think, there are enough countries in Europe now that are in favor of Ukraine's NATO membership that weren't before, because they've understood that this would have, that this is one way to ensure that, so far Russia has never attacked a NATO state. And even though it's trying to subvert them, you saw that in the Baltic states, in Poland, in other NATO members, where there, cyber interference, sabotage, all of those things. But they haven't actually, either had an air bombardment. They've tested Estonia with a fighter jet flying there. They've tested Poland with drones and Romania and other countries. So, but still, NATO membership would hopefully be the guarantee of that. So I don't know what the timetable is for that. I mean, interestingly enough, when you look at the original 28-point peace plan and you read the national strategy now of the US. In the peace plan, it says the US will mediate between NATO and Russia.
Oh my
When
gosh.
Trump
Yeah.
talks about NATO, it's as if it's an organization out there that the US doesn't belong to, even though the US, was the driving force behind founding NATO. So, I don't know. I mean, if Trump had his way, I'm not sure that the US will still be in NATO at the end of his term, although it might be. We thought with the summit that was held earlier this year that things were much better. We'll see. So, hopefully Ukraine will join NATO, but I think we're looking, we're in what, 2025 now. I mean, we're certainly looking probably to at least 2030, assuming that the next US administration doesn't have the same views as the current Trump one does.
So we can hope for these security guarantees, whatever that it would be. The
Yeah.
third part of we'll get to Peterson's comment, very interesting in a moment. Tetiana Mikolajczyk, who's actually observing from Malta. You mentioned elections in Hungary. What about the U.S. elections? If we didn't have gerrymandering, we guess we would know how the House would come out. Does this make any difference? With a White House that seems to disregard that? I'm adding this myself. This is not
Yeah.
Tatiana. Does the White House even care who dominates the House?
Well, I mean, I think it does, to the extent that, the President Trump has a legislative agenda that he wants to get through. I think there's a lot of concern in the United States about what's going to happen in the midterm elections. There's gerrymandering. Will the results be accepted if the Democrats do better? And in fact, take over at least the House of Representatives again. The Democrats did pretty well in the past few elections for governor and for other more local elections in the US. Will they accept it? But Trump, as we see, issues lots of executive orders, and that's of course a way of bypassing the Congress. So I'm not sure that, I mean, if you're talking about a foreign policy agenda, I don't think it's going to make that much difference, even if the Democrats have a majority in the House. And they may not be able to block things that they don't like, just because President Trump rules in many ways, by executive order. The Supreme Court has various cases before it, some of which will pertain to how much power the US president has, but given the current composition of the US Supreme Court, they tend to endorse a very, very strong executive power and a view of the US presidency that really is pretty imperial.
Okay, that doesn't cheer me up much.
Well, I hope you didn't expect to be cheered up.
No, certainly not. I think reality is what we need. Peterson Waweru in Nairobi, interestingly, has read the NSS and disagrees with a lot of this, but does agree that it seems that Europe is really not playing its full role in opposing Russia. If you can see the chat, a good example is Belgium opposing the use of Russia assets to fund Ukraine. Also, Spain's reluctance to increase their NATO budget. That's a factor. So it could be that NATO is really not on the solid foundation that it used to be, says Peterson Waweru. And in this, maybe the NSS makes a bit of sense.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I mean, obviously, what happened is when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a collective sigh of relief. And people's premises about, how you deal with Russia changed quite radically. And the problem is, it took people a long time to understand exactly what was happening in Russia. In the 90s, it was fairly chaotic, but Boris Yeltsin at least wanted better relations with the West, and Russia was much weaker. And therefore, much of the West relaxed, right? And NATO reformulated its own doctrines and said, Russia is no longer the enemy. And then by the time Putin came in and started changing the way that Russia was behaving internationally, it still took a very long time. And I was just going over 20 years ago, which 2005, I was involved with scenarios for Russia with the World Economic Forum, with Davos. And it struck me, I just was looking at them again the other day, how much people were focused on the idea that if Russia was integrated in the global economy, and if there were all these business ties, that would moderate Russia's view of the world. And I think these kind of illusions have lasted for a long time. And I think that people in the Trump administration still have them. And it's patently obvious that for Vladimir Putin and people like him, just because you have improved economic ties with a country does not mean that you're going to moderate your foreign policy toward them. And so I agree with you. I think that the Europeans did not do enough. They woke up too late to push back against Russia. And even now, you see them kind of scrambling to support Ukraine to the extent that they can. Germany finally is spending more on defense, but it still has a long way to go. The French and the British have, they've already been spending more on defense. Spain, as you point out, isn't willing to do that. And so in that sense, I think the criticism of NATO is valid, of the European countries in NATO is valid, that they've woken up too late to the threat, really, that Russia could pose to them. But, they can still try and revive it. But if you have a NATO where the US is a less important player, that, of course, reduces the ability of NATO to deter Russia. And NATO and European countries and the US have been they've self-deterred because they've listened to Putin's threats of using nuclear weapons, and therefore they have been less bold in what they're doing. And I think one lesson we learned from this is I think you have to be not too intimidated by these nuclear threats, because apart from the fall of 2022, when the US intelligence services thought that Putin really was considering using a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, I think you have to be more realistic about these threats.
And I guess it's not unique to the Trump administration to be thinking of a reset. I think almost every president in the last 20 years has just sought, like the famous Hillary Clinton meeting with Lavrov, where she bungled the word reset, but the idea was we want to be friends, and it seems as if Putin or his predecessors always outsmart whoever the president is. It seems.
Well,
Peterson,
this is the book I wrote, The Limits of Partnership, the one that I got the American Academy's Prize for. So I looked then, I mean, the book came out in 2014, but I looked at the attempts of all US presidents since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's Republican and Democratic, to reset relations with Russia. Every US administration. And you could say some of that was true during the Cold War too, but particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union. they've come into office thinking we can find, the golden key to unlocking a better relationship with Russia. There must be a better way. And all these attempts at reset have failed, including the Obama administration and the button that was, as you say, mistranslated into Russian as overload, not reset. And
Right.
the fundamental reason is because Russia and the US have a fundamentally different understanding of what a productive and a good relationship would be. And I come back to, Russia, Putin's Russia, but other Russian leaders believing that Russia is a great power and that in order to have a reset with the US should recognize Russia as a great power, its right to a sphere of influence. One of my Russian colleagues put this very well. He said Putin, and this is now when Putin supported the United States after the terrorist attacks of September 2001, Putin wanted an equal partnership of unequals. And I think that is just as true today. And so far, Russia hasn't gotten that, but it's quite possible that it will get it in the Trump administration. That is the irony here. But all the previous ones, have failed for different reasons.
Yeah, and it could be an American cultural, I won't use the word weakness, but a characteristic. We tend to think of if something is new, therefore it's better. And sometimes this leads us to naive actions. When a new premier comes in Russia, there were those 2 or 3 of them whose names I've forgotten, who only lasted a year or so. Each time there was a new one, Washington would say, "Oh boy, an opportunity that may be naive." Peterson adds, speaking, I don't know if Peterson speaks for the Global South, but for himself, he says, scholars now believe that NATO is just a Western European cloak of expansionism hiding under concerns of Eastern European security issues. This is a view, I think, I would dare say, Peterson, this is a view that many people in the Global South have, which is that Western multilateral organizations tend to serve the interests of Western countries only, sort of disregarding or pushing aside the interests of the Global South, which has 2/3 of the world's population. So, Peterson, thanks for that comment. I don't think there's a definitive answer, but maybe Professor Stent would like to comment on that. Is there any validity that this would be unconscious, not conscious, I think, but NATO as a tactic of Western countries really to bolster themselves, never mind 2/3 of the world's population.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that the perception in much of the Global South is that organizations like the G7, like NATO, exist really to protect and I mean, I'm including Japan and South Korea in all of this, as part of this, even though they're not members of NATO, that they exist, to protect the interests of the countries that belong there. It is true, on the other hand, that the G7, well, actually the European Union too, have had programs where they are involved in countries in the Global South. If you look at the US, and this is an initiative, actually, the George W. Bush administration, the PEPFAR program in Africa was greatly helpful in attacking the problems of HIV/AIDS, of providing nutrition, I mean, of doing things that were very important for developments in different African countries. And of course, now that's ended because USAID has been dismantled by the Trump administration. So I think in many ways, at least until January of this year, you could say that many of these organizations were involved in different ways in supporting the Global South. But it's also true that since the full-scale Russian invasion, much of the attention was taken away from that. And and therefore I understand the view that you should have a truly what the Russians and Chinese call multipolar, what I think I would rather call multilateral, if you like, world order, where where countries of the global south have more say. And I think what you've seen since the war broke out in Ukraine in 2022, you've seen some of the countries in the global south using this as an opportunity really to assert their own interests more, and not wanting to take sides, which I think is completely understandable.
Yeah, we have this very painful rupture between President Ramaphosa of South Africa and Donald
Yeah.
Trump. They seem to be not even frenemies; they're just simply enemies. And we did not attend the G20 in South Africa, and Ramaphosa is not invited to the
Yep.
U.S. for the next one. This is pretty serious stuff. I want to salute Ukraine. I don't know if people have noticed this, but in the middle of an existential conflict, they've added 5 embassies in Africa, and they are distributing food in Mauritania and Mali. This is really remarkable. First of all, their achievement in being able to get out of the Black Sea and to ship their grain because of demobilizing the Russian fleet, or almost or pushing them to the eastern side of the Black Sea. And their willingness and their ability to distribute food, I think, is really remarkable.
Yeah.
Now, Professor Stent, we have kept you for an hour and a quarter. I know that you're missing some of the coverage that you were alluding to. I don't know if it's if you want to get back to that, but would you have any concluding comments? How do we stand? A lot of this is very stark. It's very painful. We want these things to be solved. We don't see even a possible solution. We can see a temporary sort of a ceasefire, although Putin has said he won't even consider it until the root causes are addressed.
Right.
So, what do you think we can look forward to, and how should we position ourselves? I mean, let's imagine that we have positions of authority in policy making. What would policymakers be advised to do at this point? I don't think Mr. Witkoff is going to listen to any of this. But what if, I mean, let's say Marco Rubio, there was a miracle, and suddenly he became the real Secretary of State. What would you advise him to do?
Well, I first of all think that the war will continue in 2026. I mean, we're not going to get any, and even if there were an agreement, on a ceasefire, it takes a long time. You've got to work out who's going to monitor it. Things don't get better in a day. It takes time to work this all out, even if it's going to be a frozen conflict. I mean, my advice to Secretary Rubio would be, and apparently he did say this before he reversed himself, is you have to put more pressure on Russia. The only way you end this is to get Vladimir Putin to understand that he's not going to achieve his maximalist goals. He can still present this as a victory to the Russian people. He can say, we now control 18% of Ukrainian territory. And particularly if he then gets a reset and business interests in the US go into Russia, I mean, he can do this. The Kremlin controls all the media, so it's not difficult to do this. But I think you have to and the way you put pressure is, first of all, you have to keep supplying Ukraine with the weapons it needs. And therefore, even though the US is now not doing that, you have to continue this Pearl program whereby Europeans purchase American weapons and supply them to Ukraine. Ideally, the US should supply Ukraine with the Tomahawk missiles. And apparently President Trump was thinking about doing that. And then, Mr. Witkoff apprised Mr. Ushakov that something was going to happen, that Zelensky was coming to Washington, and so you got a call between Putin and Trump reversed themselves. Anyway, ideally that should happen. So you've got to give them the weapons they need, particularly the air defenses, because the Russians drones are getting much smarter now, and they're evading a lot of what Ukraine has. You have to provide them the weapons. You have to impose tougher, you have to make sure that you have these tougher sanctions on Russian oil and that they're properly implemented, and maybe more financial sanctions on Russia. And you have to give Ukraine the money it needs so that it can survive next year. And it doesn't have a huge budget shortfall. And only by doing that, I mean, Putin doesn't respond to flattery. He also doesn't, and we know that he doesn't respond to threats. I mean, the only language he will understand is if he faces a much more severe economic crisis in Russia, and if he faces continuing Ukrainian ability to stand their own ground or even push back. And absent that, I see no reason why he would come to the negotiating table, unless Ukraine is in such a bad, disadvantageous position that the US, in a way, forces it to make concessions it doesn't want to make. But we're not there yet.
Yeah. And it's always easy to find fault in the things done in the past.
Yeah.
I guess we can say that Biden, in his caution and in his legitimate fear of nuclear escalation, may not have applied pressure when it could have helped the most. Everybody, the two books that are now required, Putin's World, published in 2014, with a new edition in 2023, and The Limits of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century. These are our vademecums. These are our Bibles now. Professor Angela Stent, really, really grateful. Every time I hear you speak, I realize this is an absolute total compendium of what we have at this moment. 2 weeks from now, it'll be completely different. And we want you back.
I
Thank you.
agree. You have to keep. I get up every morning and I think, oh my goodness, what's happened last night?
No, all we can
All
do
right.
is try to understand the current moment. Thank you so much. And
Thank all of you
okay,
too.
thank you, everybody. So our last session will be this Thursday. It'll be in 3 parts, everybody. First of all, I'm going to try to summarize some of the things that we've heard this fall, because we've heard a lot of stuff. And maybe if we remember the high points or the points of reference, some of this may last longer in the memory. I will also try to introduce the module that we'll be doing in January and February on FIMI, foreign information and malicious interference, propaganda. We don't have the answer of how to deal with this challenge, but we really must think about it. Some of you, 20 or 30 of you, have said you'd like to do this. Anybody on this call, anybody is welcome to attend. And then finally, we'll have some parting comments from our friends at Delphi, Maya Otarashvili and Bob Hamilton. And then we will take a break, but we'll start again a few weeks later. Certainly is asking whether it's possible for students to submit final. Oh, okay, Tatiana. Well, first of all, let me stop the recording, but let's stay on the call. There we go. Okay.